start. The clock in the back is slow, so.
Right.
In accordance with the Open Public Meetings Act, PL 1975, Chapter 231, adequate notice of this regular meeting of the Board of Adjustment of the Township of Franklin has been provided. Please call the roll.
Raymond Betterbid.
Here.
Laura Grauman.
Here.
Donald Johnson.
Here.
Bruce McCracken.
Here.
Alan Rich.
Here.
Robert Shepard asked to be excused due to scheduling conflict. Anthony Caldwell.
Here.
Gary Rosenthal.
Here.
Joel Reese.
Yep.
Cheryl Bagallo.
Here.
And Chairman Thomas.
Here. All right, resolution, Somerset Therapeutics, ZBA 17-00007.
I move to accept. Second.
Raymond Betterbid.
Yes.
Donald Johnson.
Yes.
Alan Rich.
Yes.
Gary Rosenthal.
Yes.
Joel Reese.
Yes.
Cheryl Bagallo.
Yes.
Chairman Thomas.
Yes. All right, vouchers, Patrick Bradshaw, Kelso and Bradshaw, Doublestone Holdings, 210, Rook, Cedar Grove Lane Properties, 385, June monthly retainer, 865. Is there a motion to pay all three?
I move
Move
to
it.
pay Pat.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Hearings, the one that's listed first, we're going to move to second on the agenda and move to Alan Magsapok, ZBA 17-00010. This is a hardship variance in which the applicant is seeking approval to add a second-floor addition at 142 Harrison Street, Somerset, Block 192, Lot 62, 63, in the R7 zone.
Mr. Chairman, I'll give a brief summary of it. There was a review by the Technical Review Committee, which basically summarized the application. If you look on the second page of the report, there's a photo of the existing house. What the applicant is proposing to do is to basically utilize the existing footprint and to add a second story to the existing one-story house. There are a number of non-conforming conditions on the site, but note those are basically staying as is. The two variances that are created, really what it boils down to is the addition of a front porch, and technically those create the two variances that are required. One being building coverage, 20% is the max permitted, and the proposal is 21.3. And the front yard setback of 25 feet and 14.6 is proposed. With respect to the front yard setback, that 14.6 is actually the existing setback, and they're basically with that front porch kind of continuing that 14.6 setback that currently exists. Well, basically the same comment, similar comment with respect to lot coverage. Again, it's caused by not necessarily adding more building space, but that covered porch to the front. I think the plans that were submitted reflect the character of the house that's being constructed. I think it's a very attractive looking house. In my opinion, I think the proposed house would actually be a benefit to the neighborhood in terms of aesthetics.
Okay, we'll swear him in.
Okay, sir, if you use the microphone,
Yes, sir.
raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do, sir.
And make sure that's on. Hit it hard.
Yes.
Okay. And state your name for the record.
Alan Magsapok.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, is what Mr. Healy said basically what your intention is and the facts as you heard him, correct?
That is correct, sir. Yeah, we're retaining the existing footprint of the house for the most part, and we're just going to be building up and basically retaining what we have existing, so that way we make it easier for the submission process, and also at the same time it doesn't add additional, variances to the request.
Right, there are two new variances. Lot coverage will increase about 1%. Well, it'll be about 1% over what's permitted. Front yard setback 14.6, which is what part of the house already is, correct?
That is correct, sir, yeah.
And you're on a very small 7,000 square foot lot.
That is correct, sir, yeah.
So are you going to tell me that there is not very much room to change anything around or maneuver to reduce any of these variances to any lesser extent than they already exist?
So, part of the plan is to remove some of the,
You meant, the word is,
You're not.
you don't have any options.
oh, yes, that's
Okay.
correct, yeah.
Any other questions from the board?
The Chairman, TRC does have two recommended conditions, if the board is inclined to approve it. One would be that the lots be consolidated and that the impervious surfaces that are proposed to be removed, in fact, be removed so that they reduce the overall impervious down to, I think it's 36.5.
Okay.
You have a problem with those conditions?
Not at all.
I don't, anyone in the public would like to speak about this? I don't think there is anyone here for that. Then we'll close that, and if no one else has any question, then I'll entertain a motion
I'll move it.
and a second.
Second. Yes.
Raymond Betterbid,
Yes.
Laura Grauman,
Yes?
Donald Johnson,
Yes.
Bruce McCracken,
Yes.
Alan Rich,
Yes.
Anthony Caldwell,
Yes.
and Chairman Thomas.
Yes, okay, good luck with it, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And that's why we had you first.
Yeah, thank you.
And everyone speaking the mic the way I am, that's what she needs to hear.
Next. The trust under Article 6, Sigmund Summer, 11 Properties, ZBA 15-00017, use variance in which the applicant's proposing to construct 50 townhomes at 31 Cedar Grove Lane, Somerset, Block 468.09, Lot 34 in the R40 zone. This is carried from April 20th without any further notice required. You're on. Where are you in your presentation at this point?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members. Can you hear me? Okay. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the Franklin Township Zoning Board. That's better. There we go. Jason Harlack from Wisniewski and Associates, representing the applicant 11 Properties. As Mr. Chairman said, this is a meeting that's been continued a couple times over. We were here on December 1st of 2016. We put on testimony on that night. We were adjourned to January 19th of 2017, where we put on testimony again. At that hearing, it was adjourned because the board voted that you wanted to retain an expert in this matter. We were then put on for the March 16th meeting. We were carried to then. It was adjourned that night because an expert had not been retained yet. And then we were adjourned to April 20th, and I believe it was adjourned that night because there wasn't a quorum. So we are here today. It's been carried each time without the need for further notice. It's my understanding, Mr. Chairman, after speaking with the staff, that the board has decided not to retain an expert, and you wish for us to proceed?
At this point in time, that's correct, yes.
Okay, so if that's the case, I don't know if you need me to give a little just brief explanation, or should we just
Overview, yeah, overview.
just an overview. I'll save most of the testimony stuff until the end when I sum up, but just a brief overview. As Mr. Chairman said, this is a use variance application for a 50-unit townhouse development on Cedar Grove Lane. 38 of those units are proposed to be 3-bedroom units. 12 are proposed to be 2-bedroom units. This is just a use variance application only. We have bifurcated the application. So we come before you looking for approval for the use variance and accompanying D variances only. If we would be successful in that, my client would be submitting a subsequent application for a site plan approval in the future. So we are just looking for use variance this evening. You heard from numerous witnesses over the last 2 meetings, and like I said, I'll sum up as to what they said at the end. We do have one witness remaining, and that's our planner, Paul Phillips, so unless there are any questions, I'll bring him up.
Anybody? Okay.
Usually up at the table here is fine, just as long as you have a mic.
Two L's.
Okay, solemnly swear or affirm to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do.
And your name for the record.
Paul Phillips, Phillips.
Mr. Phillips, for the record, can you please describe your experience and expertise as a planner?
Yes, I'm a principal in the firm of Phillips Price Greigill. I've been practicing in that capacity for over 35 years. I'm a licensed professional planner in the state of New Jersey, a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. I do hold a master's degree in urban planning from Hunter College.
I think that's fine. We'll move on.
Mr. Phillips, have you had a chance to review the application and plans in this matter?
I have.
And have you come with an opinion as a planner with respect to the application?
I have.
Okay, can you please give that to the board?
Sure. So I've been retained by Levin Management to basically evaluate this application from a planning perspective. Primarily, we're here because we require a D1 use variance as townhouses are not permitted within the underlying R40 district, which is essentially a single-family residential zone which prescribes 40,000 square foot lots. We also, notwithstanding the fact that we're bifurcating the application, there would be two C variances that we would be ultimately seeking. And they would be for exceeding the maximum building as well as the maximum impervious surface coverage requirements. And again, that would be with reference to the underlying R40 district. In terms of the property itself and surrounding uses, I know this has been discussed by others. I won't belabor it, but just to refresh everybody's memory, the site consists of a single tax lot. It measures 10.67 acres, and that would be after the dedication of the right-of-way to the county. It has about 450 feet of frontage along Cedar Grove Lane, as you can see from, and I think that's exhibit A1, which is currently shown on the easel. It is an unimproved property, even though we have the site plan superimposed. Needless to say, it's unapproved, vacant, and principally a wooded site in its existing condition. In terms of the surrounding uses, the board's certainly familiar with the uses on Cedar Grove Lane. There really are diverse land uses in this area. Mr. Coco went through them at the prior hearing, but needless to say, there is a mix of multifamily residential development, hotels, single-family homes, some commercial businesses, as well as places of worship. The rear of the property, as you can see from Exhibit A1, backs up to the rear lot lines of the properties that front on World's Fair Drive, and they are principally consist of office manufacturing as well as indoor recreational facilities. As council mentioned, the project before you is a proposal for 50 townhouses, which would be distributed amongst 9 buildings, as shown on A1. The applicant is proposing a 20% set-aside of affordable units and has agreed on the record to integrate those units throughout the project. As I mentioned, the R40 zone is essentially a single-family residential district on large lots. It also permits farming and golf courses amongst the principal permitted uses. There are also a number of conditional uses that are allowed in addition to wireless facilities and public utilities. Hospitals, schools, and places of worship, as I mentioned, are permitted as conditional uses. In terms of the planning proofs, this board has certainly heard enough D variances applications over the years, and I've appeared here over the years. Clearly, an applicant must satisfy positive and negative criteria. On the positive side, an applicant has to advance special reasons in support of the application, must also demonstrate particular site suitability. The negative criteria, clearly we need to convince you that the granting of the variance would not cause substantial detriment to the public good or substantial impairment of the zone plan or zoning ordinance. And lastly, we have an enhanced quality of proof under the New Jersey Supreme Court's Medici decision, which is we need to reconcile the granting of the use variance, so you basically need to reconcile the granting of the use variance with the fact that the underlying zoning doesn't envision what we are proposing here. So let me start with what I believe are the special reasons that would support this application. I'll state up front, there are several factors that really affect this particular property. I think first and foremost, with the exception of one small parcel across the street, across Cedar Grove Lane, this is basically the only vacant developable tract within the section of the corridor from Pierce Street north to Eastern Avenue. There's a very small vacant piece across the street. You might even be able to see it from the aerial photograph. It's sort of cut off a bit, but other than that, all the other properties are essentially developed along that segment of the corridor. Secondly, if you look at the purpose of the R40 zone, and I'm going to quote the purpose in the ordinance, it says, provide for the continuance of single-family residential development on 1-acre lots. Obviously, if you take a closer examination of the surrounding development context, you will see that single-family houses is not the predominant land use, at least along this segment of Cedar Grove, again, from Pierce Street north to Eastern Avenue. As I mentioned, while there are a number of established and mostly older single-family residences, most of them, if not all of them, fronting on Cedar Grove, the corridor is primarily characterized by these other uses I mentioned: multifamily, houses of worship, some commercial, and now several hotels. In fact, there appears to be no recent evidence of any subdivision, single-family subdivision activity in the area north of Pierce Street, just by looking at the homes that exist and having some indication of when they perhaps were built. The other thing is there's actually only one of the single-family properties. We did an analysis of their compliance with underlying zoning, and only one actually fully conforms with the R40 standards, that not just lot size, but depth and lot width and frontage. So only one presently conforms. And as I mentioned, this portion of the corridor has a number of places of worship. Actually, there are several within a couple hundred feet of the property, a high concentration now within the corridor. A number of these, which I'm sure you're familiar with, are fairly extensive in terms of not just the building itself, but the parking areas relatively large, which I think all of this affects the character of the area. And certainly the other dominant use, if you closer to Eastern Avenue, the dominant use is commercial, but the other dominant use as you move towards Pierce Street is multifamily, and there are at least 3 projects, including the closest, which is across the street, which is Hidden Brook, which is a senior project of roughly 84 acres. There's the larger Lakewood Townhouse project to the southeast, and there is a project known as Ukrainian Village, which I think, and Mark, you can correct me, I think that's a senior project as well. Is it
yes,
not?
yes.
Thank you. So the point is, notwithstanding the underlying R40 zoning, I think this particular segment of Cedar Grove Lane is not primarily large lot, single family in character, consistent with the underlying R40 district. And I think from a special reasons standpoint, in my opinion, this is not what I characterize as a very desirable site for a new single family residential subdivision on large lots. You also heard at the last hearing from Chris Otto in that regard, regarding the feasibility, or in this case, the lack thereof, of developing a large lot single-family housing on this property. In fact, his testimony was that there was a hardship in seeking to develop this property consistent with the principal single-family designation. And I would just add that in and of itself, if that conclusion is reached, would qualify under the positive criteria. But I'm looking at this from, in addition, in sort of classic special reasons, particular suitability, which sort of begs the particular suitability question. Several things. I think first, As compared to conventional single-family, a townhouse development would, because it's clustered, would allow for a significant buffer and setback of the homes from the street, from Cedar Grove Lane, as well as additional separation to the industrial zoning and uses to the rear, again fronting on World's Fair Drive. I think that benefits not only potential residents of the development, but surrounding residential properties as well. As I mentioned, the setback of the closest structure, I think, is about 200 feet or more from Cedar Grove Lane. Secondly, from a particular suitability standpoint, we worked hard. We had several meetings with your professionals before the application was formally submitted in attempting to meet all the standards for townhouse development as exist in your current zoning ordinance, and we comply at this point. Lot size, density, building design, height, recreational space, all complying, which I think, again, speaks directly to particular site suitability. The only area where we do not meet is the width of private streets. There's a 30-foot requirement, and I think we are at 26 feet. But that was determined to be sufficient to permit emergency vehicle access, and we went on to provide a second emergency access, as you can see, on the southerly portion of the site per the recommendation of the Township's fire department. Again, otherwise, we would comply with the townhouse standards of the Township, which I think is a good baseline in terms of evaluating this project from a suitability standpoint. And then lastly, as I mentioned, there's clearly precedent for multifamily development as well as some townhouse development along this portion of the corridor. I see this as a suitable alternative to as-zoned single-family housing. And again, considering the predominant mix of institutional, multifamily, and commercial land uses, which obviously influence this property. I think there'd be at least three purposes of the statute that would be advanced if this variance is granted. Purpose A, which is to guide development in a manner that promotes the public welfare. Purpose E, which is to promote the establishment of appropriate population densities and concentrations. And Purpose G, which is to provide sufficient space in appropriate locations for a variety of residential uses to meet the needs of the state citizens. And again, I remind that the applicant is committed to doing a 20% affordable set-aside. With regard to the negative criteria, I'll certainly acknowledge as a professional that any development application has impacts. Any development application has impacts. The test is whether those impacts rise to the level of being substantially detrimental in nature. I do not think that is the case here for a number of reasons. I think probably most importantly, I think what I characterize as a low-density residential townhouse development is not incompatible with adjacent residential uses, meaning single-family uses. In fact, I think single-family residences and townhouses are very compatible uses, and I'll qualify that by saying provided there are appropriate setbacks and buffers basically between the uses, and I think the townhouse is really responsible uses for providing those buffers to the adjacent single-family use. I think other impacts are mitigated by the size of the property and the depth of the surrounding lots. One other thing I think is important, the density that we're seeking here translates into about 4.7 units to the acre. And again, your townhouse zoning allows, I think, as much as 6 units per acre. And Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but the affordable zones may even go higher to 8 units per acre?
Under our cluster residential zone, the base density is 6. If you provide 20%, you can go up to 8.
So that's correct. And again, we're at 4.7 units per acre, and we're still offering the 20% set aside for affordable units. We're also, based on the concept, have no more than 6 townhouse units per structure, where I believe, Mark, your ordinance allows as many as 8, if I'm not mistaken, 8 units in an attached structure.
That sounds right.
Thank you.
And,
Yeah.
Just to clarify, your 4 units includes the affordable?
Yeah, 4.7 units per acre includes the affordable. The property, as I mentioned, this is another nice aspect of the property. It's relatively deep. It's about 800 foot deep, and it allows the townhouses to be pulled back from the influence of Cedar Grove Lane, which I think is a good thing. The other thing I think is a good thing is you can pull the townhouses back basically beyond the nearest single-family residences to the south side. They're very close to the street. So by keeping the townhouses to the rear and keeping basically open space in the front, I think you're limiting impacts. And the other thing is the closest home here, I think what's important is we kept the townhouses basically at the somewhat further back from the front of the house, not putting them in front of the house in order to afford protection to that single-family residence, which you can do when you have a lot that's relatively deep. And you can also keep the townhouses a fairly considerable distance, I think over 100 feet from the rear lot line where it abuts the rear of the industrial uses on World's Fair Drive, all of which I think go to the mitigation of potential impacts on surrounding uses. And again, in the front, what's nice is there's some existing, and again, this is a bifurcated application. We don't have a detailed landscaping plan, but there's probably the opportunity to save some of the vegetation that's worthy of saving in the front, and that could also be supplemented with plantings so that you could probably buffer the frontage so that, for the most part, you may not even see the townhouses from Cedar Grove Lane. We've provided more parking than is required by RSIS. As I mentioned, we had meetings with the township's professionals. They were concerned about problems associated with overflow parking demand. They made that absolutely clear, so we've gone above and beyond what RSIS requires in terms of parking to meet that concern. I see no impacts to the M2 zone properties in the rear due to the separation of the units and the potential for buffering. And again, lastly, as I've noted, there's clearly a precedent for multifamily and specifically townhouses within this segment of the R40 zone. So I think for these reasons, I think that the first part of the negative criteria can be satisfied. Last part of the negative criteria is the zone plan impacts, and as I mentioned, the reconciliation under Medici. As with the first part of the test, any use variance by its nature is going to be inconsistent with the current zone plan and to some extent the master plan. I will note for the board that the most recent master plan reexamination, and it's relatively recent, specifically looked at this quarter and not the entire R40 district or the entirety of the Cedar Grove quarter, and there's a statement in the plan. I'm going to read it. It says that Cedar Grove Lane north of New Brunswick Road, and then it says, and particularly north of Pierce Street, this corridor has been developed with a mixture of multifamily housing, some commercial uses, and large-scale places of worship. And then the re-exam goes on by stating that the master plan should evaluate the zoning of the Cedar Grove Lane corridor north of New Brunswick Road with potentially low-intensity non-residential uses. So I think this is interesting, and while I believe, if I'm reading this correctly, and I'll defer to Mark, who probably wrote the document, I don't think this recommendation is going so far as to say that R40 single-family zoning should be radically changed or that single-family housing should be eliminated from the zone, but it does at the very least suggest that some consideration should be given to other low-intensity uses. And I think the term used was low-impact non-residential uses. Obviously, this is a residential project, but I think it is relatively low impact. You heard from our traffic engineer. I think it's relatively low impact from a traffic standpoint. I think from an intensity standpoint, given the density proposed, it's relatively low impact. And I think visually, given what we could do in terms of the setbacks, I think it is also relatively low impact. And in fact, would potentially compare favorably to other non-residential uses that you may or may not be considering in light of that master plan recommendation. And I would also say that the conditional uses that are allowed can potentially be intense as well, such as a school or even a house of worship that may have under the umbrella of a house of worship daycare or a school associated with it. So again, looking at the surrounding development pattern, there's been no new recent single-family housing construction north of Pierce Street for quite some time. And while houses of worship are permitted conditional use, they've pretty much almost come to dominate this portion of the quarter. They've almost become more the rule than the exception. I will tell you that this is quite atypical of a conditional use. Usually, I'll just finish my thought and then I'll get your question if you don't mind. Usually a conditional use is more the exception than the rule. Here you have, I think, at least 4 houses of worship along the corridor. But I will say that it's very much an idiosyncratic use, which may or may not have any future demand at this location. And I think Mr. Otto spoke to that as well during his testimony. So for these reasons, I think there's a basis to grant the relief consistent with the standards established under Medici. And I say that basically in that the master plan, I think, recognizes that this portion of the corridor is not or has not developed primarily for single family, and at the very least other uses should be considered. So I think for that reason, the variance request is not inconsistent with the intent and purposes of the zone plan. I'm sorry, I just was on a flow.
So let me correct the record a little bit. On Cedar Grove Lane, just south of New Brunswick Road, there is another townhouse development that's been here a few times. So there are other townhouse in the planning stage.
I think that's south of Pierce, but not south of
No,
New Brunswick.
it's south of New Brunswick, just before the sand and gravel place.
Okay, then I'm aware of one that's south of Pierce, but not south of New Brunswick.
It's between Pierce and New Brunswick.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's my
what I said.
understanding.
Yeah, so it's south of New Brunswick.
Yeah.
And north of Pierce.
I think
It's
it's
north.
north of New Brunswick and south of Pierce.
That's right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
On the other side of no, it's
South of Pierce, north of New Brunswick.
yeah, but the sand and gravel place.
Yes.
So that's-
Opposite Cedar Grove Shopping Center.
Yeah. So that's before New Brunswick. Yeah.
And let me just say, you bring up a good point. Let me just say for the record, and I know Mr. Otto testified to the issues of feasibility, and that's not I'm a planner. But from a locational perspective, in my mind, clearly that this area, and if you can pick New Brunswick Road, you could pick Pierce. But clearly, I think the areas north of either to Easton are decidedly different than the area south of New Brunswick. It is absolutely clear to me that the area south of New Brunswick Road is single-family residential. There may be a house of worship in there, but that is clearly a single-family established residential area, and in my mind doesn't have the same mixed-use characteristics as the area further north as you get closer to Easton Avenue.
Did you pay attention to the comments made by the fire prevention director here?
I think we addressed the fire comments, if I'm not mistaken. There was an issue, as I mentioned, with the width of the street.
Second means of access?
Emergency access, which
Yeah.
we provided to
Right.
address his comments.
You pay attention to that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we are providing the second means of access. We did increase the roads to 26 feet. We did increase the parking beyond RSIS. And their fourth comment is they reserve the right to make additional comments.
Okay,
I think
thank
we
you.
addressed them.
Thank you.
Very quickly, there's just 2 C variances, and then I'll be happy to answer questions, but I think it's pretty straightforward. Building coverage, lot coverage, I think the reason that we don't comply is because those standards are meant for R40, single-family, low-density residential district. We are proposing a 15% building coverage where 10% is permitted. I don't think 15% building coverage in the context of low-density townhouses is excessive. And I think we're at 55% impervious coverage, which means 45% green space. Again, in the context of what we are proposing, I think the granting of that relief would certainly be legitimate. And certainly in some of the recent case law before the state Supreme Court, it's clear that these kind of variances are subsumed within the D variance per se. I would also just add that one of the reasons we are higher on impervious coverage is that, again, in our discussions and working with the town professionals, we made several revisions to the original plan, which led to some increase in the impervious coverage. As I mentioned, we increased the visitor parking. We increased the width of the drive aisles to meet the fire department's recommendation, and we did provide for the second emergency access as well. So I think for those variances, I think the same purposes of the statute would be advanced, and I see no substantial detriment if those variances were granted together with the D variance for the townhouses proposed.
Mark, I have a question to you. With this development and the other planned townhouse, the big church, each project has their own traffic report, but it doesn't combine.
Use the mic, Joe.
Oh, but it doesn't. We don't see a combined traffic result of all these developments in a quarter-mile area. Yeah.
Well, I haven't looked at the traffic report in a number of months, but
Yeah.
typically, and is the traffic expert here? Okay, but typically, the traffic report would incorporate known and planned developments in their study.
But I don't think this does. Okay, it doesn't.
I don't know. Again, I haven't looked at it in a few months. I looked
Mark,
at it
I'm
when I
pretty sure
initially
he
reviewed it.
did, and we can check if there's a break, but I'm pretty sure the traffic engineer did look at the planned developments in the area. I think at your suggestion, but
Because I can
confirm that.
Yeah, and that's standard practice, because I can tell you that whenever a traffic expert does these reports, staff usually gets a call to ask about, are there any approved or planned developments in the surrounding area. They include that in the analysis. Usually they incorporate some type of growth factor to, accommodate for,
It does.
future.
It says analysis of future traffic.
Yeah, so, that's typically what's in there. Again, I haven't looked at this particular report in a matter of months, so I can't really speak to it directly.
Is his testimony completed?
There are no further questions to this.
Well, what you're part of it, are there any other questions?
Question. What is the date of the master plan re-exam?
It's fairly recent. I have it. I think it may be 2016.
Yep.
Okay, and the recommendation for this part of Cedar Grove Lane is to evaluate zoning with low-density non-residential uses.
I think it's low intensity was, I think, what was used.
Low-intensity non-residential uses. Was this site identified for cluster residential or townhouse use?
Not specifically. The recommendation didn't take it that far. It just, I think, acknowledged in the preceding paragraph that the use mix is not essentially in keeping with the underlying zoning, and it says maybe some other uses should be considered, but it didn't go beyond that.
Okay. And was this site identified for potential inclusion in the affordable housing plan?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And it's your opinion that a townhouse development would be consistent with the recommendation for evaluating the area for non-residential use?
What my testimony is that notwithstanding that the generic recommendation in the master plan was for low impact, I think they used the term low impact non-residential uses, my testimony is, and obviously we're residential, but my testimony is that I think what the master plan, and Mark can speak to this, was basically opening the door to consider other uses, and I think the initial determination was probably non-residential. I'm not sure what kind of low-intensity non-residential uses there are, but basically I'm indicating that while we're residential, I think we would meet the intent of being low impact for the reasons that are articulated.
Okay, but it's not consistent with the non-residential
Absolutely not.
recommendation. Thank you.
I think, as I recall in those discussions, the planning board was of the mind that the zoning in general in the area you're describing is what needed to be reevaluated. Whether that means it was going to change or not change never came to that point. You do point out a lot of different uses in that, a variety of different densities and uses, so it's something that's been left hanging more or less.
Well, at some point, hopefully later this year, the planning board will get back to finishing up the land use or the master plan process. Essentially what that recommendation is acknowledging, as Mr. Phillips said, is north of New Brunswick and then particularly north of Pierce, the corridor is what it is. It's a mixture of uses. There's some single family, there's large scale places of worship, there's a shopping center, there are office buildings. And in that context, evaluating, and it's a major roadway with access to Easton Avenue. So evaluating that corridor north of New Brunswick for some type of, in terms of the master plan, the recommendation was to look at some low scale, maybe converting some of the allowing some of those existing homes to be converted to medical office buildings, for example, things of that nature. That's what the recommendation contemplated. Low intensity, non-residential use.
What makes it difficult in terms of for the board, the planning board, the uses that are non-residential or non-R40, most of them were imposed or incorporated in that corridor through a planned unit development in 1975. The multifamily housing, the Cedar Grove Shopping Center, the Hilton Hotel is actually in a different zone. All of those uses were exempt from zoning at that point back in that day. There really hasn't been a tremendous lot of development along that corridor that you mentioned since then, which is quite a long time. So it doesn't mean they were all built in 1975, but that's when it was the Quailbrook units and all of those were different things were approved. Even the office building, Progressive Office Plaza, is a part of that planned unit development that was there, and that's another reason maybe that the board needs to look at all of the zoning and the different uses. All the churches and religious institutions are, there are pros and cons with all of those things, and I'll try and be politically correct. They are conditional uses. They are absolutely not low impact uses, and if anybody is sitting here who thinks they are, I think they're, not on any planet than anybody else is. So, all of this needs to be considered. I appreciate some of your comments on that. Are there any other questions?
Just a question on, you used the word idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
Everything we've been saying is proof of that. So that I'm looking at, there's one single family house beside it, which is does that lot go all the way back? Is that a 40,000 square foot lot, or?
Well, there are two here. I believe they go, this one almost goes all the way back. This one kind of jogs a little bit. I can confirm that off a tax map, but I think the lot lines are on here, if I'm not mistaken. one almost goes all the way back and the other goes back and then jogs a little bit. But they're also deep, single-family lots.
And the other thing that was that you had to squeeze in from 30 feet to 26 feet to get all, the space. So you kind of got an undersized lot to get all those 50 units in.
Well, I think,
If-
and
if
they
you
would,
had-
I'm sorry.
Well,
didn't
I guess
realize- yeah.
I'm making a point about two single-family lots beside it. If you had an undersized lot, you could combine the undersized lot. If a person wanted to sell it to you, you know what you do when you have that kind of situation. I don't know if you could create a little bit of space in there, and you'd have the existing single families would go away.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I can't, speculate as to those possibilities. Maybe that's, would potentially be in the cards. But what I will say is that I think what's important to address the issue of the 26-foot wide internal streets, I think we were actually at a lesser width early on, and we then went up to 26, and I think we're going beyond RSIS on the width. We wanted to meet the needs of your professionals in your fire department, and even with the 26-foot width, we were amenable to putting in the emergency access road. So I think we met the intent. Mark can speak for himself, but of your professionals and the fire department. With regard to this, you're saying that this perhaps doesn't look generous on the site. I would reiterate that we're on a very, very low density for townhouses relative to what your ordinance permits, both for solely market rate as well as for an inclusionary project. And I think what's key in terms of the fit is that we meet the townhouse standards. And I have to defer to Mark on this, but I'm assuming that some of your townhouse zones do, in certain locations, abut single family. I mean, I didn't do a thorough review of the zoning map, but I have to believe that in some instances, because I believe professionally that those uses are compatible with appropriate safeguards in place.
Yes, the nearest one's Cedar Manor, I believe. Yeah, that's certainly abuts single family in places, and I'm sure others do as well.
You have that in Quailbrook. Multifamily units with sections of them that border sections of one-family
Yes.
houses. That's partly in the same area.
And to that topic too, one of the potential conditions, if the board is inclined to approve it, was at one of the previous meetings, the board had indicated that you wanted the applicant to work on the buffering, have a minimum 50-foot along Cedar Grove, and then at the time of the site plan to amend, to try to modify the site plan in terms of the recreation, the basin, emergency access, and building 9 to try to achieve a large, as large a buffer as possible to joining lots 33 and 35. So that would be, again, if the board was inclined to approve it, that would be incorporated into the resolution and something that the applicant would need to work on and come back to you in terms of buffering those two adjoining residences.
Mr. McCracken, just to add on to your question, I'm not an engineer, but at the last meeting, our engineer did testify that this was actually a low number of units for this size of a piece of property, that he thinks that if it was arranged differently, he can get it between 75 and 80 units on this property. So I don't think it's an undersized property. I think engineering-wise, as Mr. Phillips testified to, we're at a density of 4.7, and if we were at 80, the density would be much greater. And based on the engineer's comments, he said based on talks to the professionals, we came back with 50 instead of that higher number. So I don't believe it is a undersized lot, but I would leave that to him to testify to.
Got it. 4.7 sounds pretty low. I mean, out on 27, I think most of those that we have out there are 7 per acre. They're pretty, the townhouses.
Townhouse, most of our cluster residential developments Most of them have affordable in them, and they're built at 8. Cedar Manor is 8, for example.
Yeah, and I remember we wanted to keep that bus service going. And the other thing I
Granted,
noticed.
those are permitted uses.
Yeah, right.
So they build to the max of that zone, and this is a use variance, but it's a useful comparison.
There was we put in there was a beneficial use of senior buildings for Bob Frank's Way. And there was, I think, single family there. Do you know where I'm talking about?
Ukrainian village.
Ukrainian Village?
Well, no, it's
No, it's right across the street.
on the other side,
Hidden
across
Brook?
the street, down.
Yes,
Hidden
Brook.
Brook. Yeah,
Hidden Brook?
yeah.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
I know we had this discussion about, I think we took a house, or at least it was close to a house, a single family. And so there was an access road that
Yeah,
went in and behind.
Yeah, that access, I think, weaves through some older single-family lots, Mark, to the Hidden Brook, as I recall, or?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
That the access to Hidden Brook on the opposite side of the street, there are adjoining single-family houses, and I think the access road, kind of cuts in between or is adjacent to at least one single-family
Yeah, it does. It
lot, as
goes
I
right
recall.
between two
You can see
houses.
it
Yes,
on the exhibit
Yeah.
that the applicant gave. Bob Frank's Way is really the applicant, is really Hidden Brook's driveway. It's kind of tucked in between
Right,
two
two
homes. Hidden Brook's kind of, really almost kind of on a flag lot, kind of tucked behind homes with the driveway going out to Cedar Grove.
It basically is a flag lot. It was created that way. The driveway does go between, and that was a big issue at that time, getting enough buffering along that driveway on both sides of it.
Yeah, it was kind of like, I remember we were listening to the single-family homeowners saying, what are you going to do to get that buffering in there? Yes, that was a big issue for them. I don't know about these people.
Well, again, I think
Have you talked to them?
the nice thing about the low density here is that we were able to get those buildings back 200 feet or more from the street, and we
Yeah.
get them back beyond the house line, so that those buildings aren't in front, and we kind of preserve some of that single-family context for the abutting, and particularly the home to the south, which is very, very close to the street. And as I think someone mentioned, Mark mentioned, that you'll have the opportunity, since this is a bifurcated application, to ensure that there is adequate buffer, and particularly to that lot, that single-family lot to the north. I think, if I'm not mistaken, right now we've got a minimum setback, I think at its closest point, of about 50 feet, which in my mind is not a bad setback, and I think it complies with the townhouse standards. But again, assuming the variance is granted, you'll have another shot at some of these issues at site plan.
Any other questions?
If there are no questions, I just have one point to follow up with Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips, there was some talk about the 2016 re-examination of the master plan. Just for clarification, it's my understanding that you brought that up as an addition to your testimony of positive and negative criteria, correct?
Well, I brought it up specifically since we've got a enhanced quality approved standard under Medici, where we have to reconcile the fact that the underlying zoning, which is the legislative intent, doesn't envision this use. And I think the point I'm trying to make to the board is that I think the master plan, although it didn't make specific land use recommendations, acknowledged that this segment of Cedar Grove has not developed consistent with the zoning, and maybe other uses should be considered.
Thank you. That's all.
Any other questions? We will open to the public, which we have none, so we'll close. Anything else?
I have no further witnesses. If I may have a few minutes just to sum up.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. This has been a long time coming. It's been a 7-month process, so I don't usually like to go over everything, but just for the board's edification, I'm just going to give a brief summary of what we heard over the last couple meetings. As I said at the beginning, we've started here on December 1st. You heard from some of our witnesses. We were carried to January 19th so that some of those witnesses could do some additional reports, give you guys some additional information. At the hearing on January 19th, we were then carried. We had a couple of meetings where we were adjourned, and we're back here today. Overall, as we said, we're looking for a use variance and the accompanying C and D variances for a 50-unit townhome development with 38 of those units being 3-bedroom and 12 being 2-bedroom. You've heard from 6 different witnesses, and I'll kind of just go through them for you real quick. First was Fred Coco, our architect, who presented the engineer, who presented the exhibit that's on the board now, A1. He walked us through that use variance plan. He showed the 38, talked about the 38 3-bedroom units and the 12 2-bedroom units. He also spoke about the parking, which is 169 parking spots. The RSIS standards are 119 parking spots, so we exceed that by 50. So with the 50 units, that's one extra car for every unit. Of those 169 parking spots, 50 are garage spots, 50 are driveway spots, and 69 are street spots. We talked, and Mr. Phillips talked about the 2 other variances that would be required as well. Secondarily, as I said to Mr. McCracken before, Mr. Coco came back on at the January 19th meeting to give some brief testimony, and in that testimony, he spoke about the plan in general and how we came up with 50 units. I know there were some questions at the time as to how we got there, and he testified to the fact that, in fact, this lot size is big enough to fit 75 to 80 units, but we came with 50 to keep the density lower based on discussions with the township professionals, and he thought that it was a very suitable plan for this site. It also allowed us to give the secondary emergency access, the wider roadways, and things of that nature to help with the fire department. We next heard from Mike Testa, the architect. He talked about the differences between the 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units. The square footage of those units, just to remember, is 3-bedroom is roughly 2,015 square feet, and the 2-bedroom is 1,940 square feet. He also talked about the 11 affordable housing units that are going to be there, and as Mr. Healy pointed out, we did at that time agree to spread out those units across the development so they weren't all clustered in one particular spot. And he also talked about how those units would be no different than the other units. There's no special design for those units. They would all be designed the same way. Next heard from our traffic engineer, Scott Cannell. He testified at both hearings. At the first hearing, he testified to the traffic report that he had conducted, and his basic premise was that Cedar Grove Lane, as everyone here talked about at the time and everyone here knows, is a very heavily traveled roadway. But as Mr. Phillips just stated, the intensity of this development is not really going to have an effect on Cedar Grove Lane because it's already so heavily traveled. And that the question really was what was going to be the effect on Cedar Grove Lane on the development. Because of those questions, the board had asked him to do what they call a gap study. So we had adjourned at that time, and we came back on January 19th with the gap study results. The gap study results showed that there were sufficient gap intervals for the cars coming in and out of the facility to make turns. And he's saying what happens with the gap study is what you look at is how much room there is in between cars, and is that going to give the person either pulling in or pulling out the time they need to do it. And he said that there were more than enough. We then heard from Bob Carson, who is the Executive Vice President of Levin Management. He talked that Levin Management has been marketing this property for over 5 years at the time. Now it's closer to 6 years almost. And he talked about the unique nature of this property and why it's hard to market, the fact that there's very little frontage, so it makes it hard for commercial because obviously you need more frontage for that, and that it's a very deep property, which Mr. Phillips also talked about. And that during all their time, marketing this property, they didn't have any feasible offers. At that time, there was questions to him about the marketing of the property, and those questions were also answered by Chris Otto, our next witness. Mr. Otto, as I'm sure most of you remember, was up for quite some time at the first meeting, and then pretty much the entire time at the second meeting. Mr. Otto is the real estate market analyst that was hired to analyze this property. To try to summarize everything he said is almost impossible, but just to break it down quite simply, he testified that townhouse development is the only financially feasible use of this property. He then went on to state that how this property was marketed by my client, by Mr. Carson, is how these properties are typically marketed. These are not the types of properties where you put up signs or you put anything on the MLS. These are properties that are done through brokers, through who you know, not somebody coming off the street looking to buy it because of the size and the expense of these types of properties. And he said that it's been marketed in his expertise properly, and what Mr. Carson said, there really haven't been any takers. And then tonight, you heard from Mr. Phillips, our planner, and I'm not going to bore you all with the summary because you just heard from him, and he's much more impressive than I am with respect to this. However, he did talk about the positive and negative criteria, the fact that it serves the general welfare, that it's particularly suitable, and also confirmed what Mr. Otto was trying to get across, is that there is an undue hardship with respect to this property, just based on the feasibility of nothing else really being feasible for the property. He also spoke about the negative criteria, that the variances could be granted without substantial detriment to the public good, and that it will not substantially impair the intent and zone of the plan. With that being said, we will submit to the board and ask for a vote and ask for approval of our use variance application along with the other variances that we've talked about throughout the course of this hearing.
Okay, any questions? I'll make the statement that we won't open to the public for any statements since there is no other public here, but if there are no questions or discussion, I'll entertain a motion.
Mr. Thomas, I apologize, Mr. Chairman, just before we vote, I know since we've had several different hearings, I just want to make a request as to who, if everyone has reviewed all the tapes for all the meetings, if everyone is eligible to vote. I know, I don't believe Mr. McCracken was here for either meeting.
I'm not voting.
Okay, and I know that there were some people who were here for the first meeting who weren't for the second, and vice versa. So,
I
filed the
entertained myself this
certification.
afternoon
thank you.
with my iPad.
Well, I
We s-
think Mr. Phillips is worth every last penny that you paid him. I think his planning testimony really puts this away in my mind.
If I
I'll
could-
agree with that. I've been involved in a lot of years. That's probably the best planning testimony I've heard. He's certainly the only one I ever heard who actually admitted that every development has an impact. Usually, we have heard how 1,100 houses will have no impact on anybody. And he also showed real familiarity with the area and the surroundings, so that it gave some more credibility to me to what he was testifying to. Any other comments?
I just wanted to offer concern about the positive criteria aside, the negative criteria and the impairment of the master plan. The master plan has a recommendation for non-residential uses in that corridor. This is the largest, the planner said, this is the largest vacant piece of property in that corridor. The master plan was re-examined last year, and there was no recommendation for this site to be anything other than single-family residential or non-residential. I think to grant the use variance for multifamily residential would be an impairment of the master plan, and the application fails on that prong. I think an appropriate way for this to go would be for the planning board to look at this site again and do a land use plan amendment, for the governing body to do a zoning ordinance amendment. I know I'm not going to vote on this application, but I just wanted to share that with the board.
Other comments? All right, again, we'll look for a motion.
There were a number of potential conditions. Do you want me to read those back? Okay. They would be for sale units. 10%, or I'm sorry, 20% would be affordable. That'd be 10 affordable units integrated throughout. They'd have to follow applicable COA rules, low mod income, split, administrative agent, bedroom mix, deed restriction, etc. The rec component, the applicant would need to work that out more specifically during site plan, exactly what they would be providing. Sidewalk along the frontage, the buffer, as indicated before, 50-foot, they would seek to get 50-foot buffer along the front, and and they would try to get a 50-foot buffer, but as much as possible along the side property lines, along lots 33 and 35, where they adjoin the adjoining homes. And to do so, they would look to relocate the emergency access drive, the basin, building 9, and/or the rec to accommodate this buffer. And again, they try to maximize that buffer as much as they could. And right now, the bedroom mix that they've indicated is 38 3-bedroom, 2-bed, or would be 12 2-bedroom. So I think a condition that there'd be no more than 38 3-bedroom would be a condition the board might want to consider.
Okay, now we need a
Make
motion.
a motion subject to those conditions.
And we need a second.
Second.
Any further discussion? I'll just add, I appreciate Cheryl's comments. From discussions on the master plan, one of the considerations that came out of that's was evolving at the time is having a commercial node somewhat around the corner of Easton Avenue on Cedar Grove Lane, where you now have Madison Hotel, the Spring Hills. You always had the office building from years ago, and not so much, there hasn't been any real discussion or any conclusions about non-residential uses from there on. So while I appreciate her concerns about the impact on the master plan, the best we can do is make the decision on this application based on what we heard. I have gone both ways for a couple of times. I think, I'm going to support it. So if there are any other discussion, all the board.
Raymond Betterbid,
Yes.
Laura Grauman,
Yes.
Donald Johnson. Alan Rich,
Yes.
Anthony Caldwell,
Yes.
Gary Rosendahl,
Yes.
and Chairman Thomas.
Yes. Should have put the planner on first. Would have saved a lot of meetings. If there's no other discussion, we'll have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
move.
All in favor? Motion adjourned. Meeting adjourned. Sorry.